You're watching Stat News Global. I'm Amita Bravi, and it's a pleasure to connect with Jacob Helberg from San Francisco. He's a senior advisor with Stanford's Cyber Policy Center, as well as an adjunct fellow with the Center for Security and International Studies. Pleasure having you on board.
Pleasure to be with you.
If I can just look at the global situation, and all individual countries are facing similar situations, whether it's in terms of COVID and what we've seen with China's both physical aggression, territorially and technological aggression. What seems to come out now is that both the public and the government, they may have been aware as well, but it's of a larger dimension now, are not only aware of the threat, but are acting on it.
I think they are. In a lot of ways, and there's a saying in Silicon Valley that the coronavirus has accelerated a lot of long-term trends that were already in motion. And I think the public becoming more skeptical and frankly hawkish on the various comprehensive threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party was not only timely, but ripe. And we're seeing that with members of Congress and legislators, as well as in the presidential campaign that we're in the midst of in the United States, where people are increasingly raising questions about where medication is coming from, where ventilators are coming from, as well as things more benign, like where's TikTok's engineering team based, and what access does the Chinese government have to the personal information collected from those types of applications. And in many ways, the Indian government really led the way in very bold policy measures in India.
When you talk about the Indian measures, I'm just going to come to the actions. But since you looking at apps, and Hong Kong is a test case now. We've seen what's happening there. Encryption, everybody is looking for a very secure encryption, because people are getting off social media because they're worried of what can happen because of the national security law. So test case in the sense of from both sides. Even China probably testing how much it can push Western tech firms and its own firms globally in this whole scenario.
The trend that we're seeing is, in a lot of ways, a lot of companies that were used to being able to live in a world where a policy of engagement towards China was fine when China was a responsible stakeholder in the international system. In recent years, China has not only become more authoritarian at home, but it's also grown much, much more revisionist internationally. And it's a problem because when you have the world's second largest economy as an autocratic country that wants to make the world more like itself, that has a lot of implications for democracies. When you have two legal systems, one of which is predicated on total compliance with the Chinese Communist Party in terms of handing over intellectual property, personal information of users, and the other system that's predicated on the protection of that information and the protection of personal privacy and intellectual property and government secrets, those two systems are inherently in conflict. And when you look at the recent national security law, which, as you know, has a lot of extraterritorial applications to it, the more we see China engage in extraterritorial application of its laws, the more that tension will become increasingly strong, and the deeper the incentive will be for policymakers in India, as well as the United States and in Europe, to draw a line in the sand and ask companies to choose which side they're going to be on.
You pointed out earlier in this discussion that you felt that the Indian government had taken very strong measures in banning those 59 Chinese applications. Why would you say so? Would you say because people thought the effect of that could be tremendous, or has that shown that China can be taken on?
I think it's something that seems strong from an American perspective, because we have a cultural sense that there is a healthy distinction between the government and markets. And government's involvement in markets has historically been very limited by international standards. in the United States. And therefore, the government taking an action as drastic as banning an application is not just a little bit at odds with America's tradition of free markets, but also raises free speech questions. I think the reason for which I actually think there's a lot of merits to the decision that the Indian government made is that there are two profound problems that we're dealing with. The first is there is the asymmetry and the legitimate demands for trade reciprocity. As you know, most American content platforms are banned in China, including Netflix, YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and the like. And so the US government demanding a certain reasonable degree of trade reciprocity, I think to most Americans would not seem unreasonable. And then there's, of course, the issue of cybersecurity risks and the fact that with every passing day, there is more evidence that emerges about the incredibly vast scope of the kinds of data that is being collected by seemingly benign applications like TikTok. And those cybersecurity risks are harder to communicate to a large public, the American public, but they're very, very real nonetheless.
When you talked about trade reciprocity, and we've seen that even with there hardly any Indian tech firms, even though our software is known around the world in China, not allowed there. So again, the effect of a ban like this, is it because it can hit China where it hurts, and it shows them up in terms of, I think you used the phrase that the emperor has no clothes.
It does show that the emperor has no clothes. A lot of people, at least in the United States, have been whispering about should we ban TikTok, and I think there's a lot of fear of going there. And the Indian government did it, and the sky didn't fall. And I think it shows that it should serve as a reminder to democracies that democracies have every reason to have enough self-confidence to do what's right for their country without having to constantly be afraid of what repercussions they might face with Beijing.
And the dangers, like you said, it may be difficult to communicate to the larger public as a whole in terms of the dangers of cybersecurity. Uh, but we've seen what's happened in the past with the US, with other Western countries, Australia, the Prime Minister coming out and saying there's, cyber attacks against the country there. There's so. Would you want to distinguish between, say, individuals being targeted on a mass scale and institutions being targeted, whether it's for cybersecurity, whether it's for information that they are trying to glean?
I think the big distinction should be not so much based on should be based on who is doing the targeting, and the reason is the state-backed actors doing this kind of targeting for their various intelligence collection, espionage, economic espionage, and in some cases political extortion purposes. Is the reason I find myself concerned with it is because it's increasingly becoming a defining feature of international politics that geopolitical conflict is increasingly taking place over and through the internet and through technology because it's very hard to attribute and it's very, very high impact. And the Chinese government has, better than anybody, not only understands that, but has leveraged that tool to the best of its ability to collect as much data as possible in order to meet its national goals on achieving certain technological development milestones, as well as to collect information about key strategic individual targets. In a slightly different context, in a non-China context, we've seen this happen with other states, like, for example, the Saudi Arabian government allegedly hacking Jeff Bezos' phone. So increasingly, we're seeing state actors use technology to achieve their geopolitical objectives. And it's increasingly becoming a defining feature in international politics. And so that should raise a lot of questions for policymakers as to how they should engage in this space.
I'll take up from that last point, and not only Saudi Arabia, Russia has been accused, Iran, North Korea. So how do policymakers deal with this issue then?
Finding a way of establishing deterrence and attribution, I think, will
Mm.
absolutely be. Attribution is hard, it's not always possible, but I think ultimately there is a clean, principled, a democratically friendly way of having narrow private-public collaborations for the purpose of identifying real-world actors engaging in foreign interference, influence, and intrigue in the United States and in other like-minded countries.
You talked about reciprocity not being there. That's one issue, the trade issue. Then the cybersecurity. But when you want to deal with the threat that is coming, and you were also pointing out how the tech companies, especially the Western tech companies, US tech companies, shouldn't be sitting on the fence anymore. Uh, they can't deal with this one country, two system anymore. But some a huge company like Apple, say, which actually does majorly operate out of China, how do they deal with that? They've spent so much money, they've spent so much technology in terms of developing the skill set that Foxconn has, and moving those supply chains out to whether it's a software rich country like India or Indonesia or Vietnam is not going to happen overnight.
It's not going to happen overnight. There are some things that the government can do right away, and then there are other things that will inherently be a long-term project. The some of the measures that the Indian government has implemented in terms of banning the applications are steps that that governments are examples of steps that the governments can take in order to draw lines in the sand of what is okay from a trade standpoint and what is not. But in terms of what you were referring to with Apple's exposure
Yeah.
with supply chains in China, that will have to be a slightly longer term project. Although I think the level of urgency would justify governments investing the resources and efforts in order to do this as expeditiously as possible. It will have to be a comprehensive approach, both not just on the supply of finding an economically feasible and logical way of redistributing supply chains within allied countries for critical goods, but also on the demand side to ensure that companies in India and in the United States have access to a market that is at least as large as China's in order to
Yeah.
make sure that that those companies will always be competitive from a market cap standpoint, as well as from a scale standpoint, in order to make the kinds of big investments they need into moonshot technologies to stay ahead of the curve.
You talked about cyber surveillance, cyber security, cyber sabotage, whether it's the mining of the data as well. What about how you're pointing out that how warfare, international warfare, has moved into the cyber sphere and the Cold War that has been developing there in terms of misinformation, disinformation? And you've seen how it could be one app, but several apps come together, are mined together, or the data is mined together to glean something that could be extremely valuable for the opposing side, which in this case is China. How do you deal with that?
And this is where I think the measures taken by the Indian government are interesting, and I think will actually be um, we'll know a year or two from now what the potential impact of those decisions were, and it'll be a really interesting educational experience for other governments. Because, as you know, the Indian government banned not just one or two apps, but 59 of
Yeah.
them. Um, Ultimately, I think you're pointing out a really hard issue, which is the Chinese government has the ability of collecting data from companies like TikTok, but they also do things like hack the Office of Personnel Management in the United States, and then they can cross-pollinate the data in order to see people's employees of the federal government that have security clearance that also have certain psychological frailties that could be exploited in order to cultivate them as informants or as spies. Um, and that does pose real risks and concerns. Obviously, we saw slightly different psychological warfare operations conducted by the Russian government in 2016, and Since then, the Chinese government and the Iranian government have joined the chorus in 2020 and are now mirroring each other. And so, appreciating the fact that in democracies there is a strong tradition of free speech, I think it'll be really interesting and very important for democratic governments to um, think through whether or not there should be a difference drawn between um, the content that these governments are putting out and looking at the broader pattern of behavior that they're engaging in. And an analogy would be that it should, of course, be completely fine for the Russian government to publish a book, but
Yeah.
should we allow the Russian government to stack the bookshelf and swamp the bookshelf at the expense of everyone else's book? If you think of platforms that operate based on limited screen real estate, like the Facebook feed or like Twitter, where it's automatically binary and content is ranked up or down, it is very much like a bookshelf. And what the content that ranks up is the content that gets the most views and the most clicks. And therefore, I would argue that governments do not have an inherent right to manipulate platforms in order to uprank their content and manipulate and deceive users.
Jacob Helberg, absolute pleasure talking to you. Absolutely fascinating discussion that, of course, can go on forever. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And for all our viewers, just a reminder, if you want to get the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective, just log on to our website, Strat News Global. Follow us on our social media sites on Instagram, Twitter, and on Facebook as well. And if you want to get live notifications or reminders for videos that we put up like this one, just click on the bell icon on our YouTube channel. You're watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.